Summer's End, 1931, just outside Clarksburg, West Virginia. In a hollow called Quiet Dell, a two-story garage stood with its doors shut and its secrets buried beneath the floor. The man who owned it called himself Cornelius Pearson when he wrote to widows and single mothers through Lonely Hearts Clubs. On legal papers he was Harry F. Powers. In Holland he'd been Herman Drenth. Whatever the name, the promise was the same: security, marriage, a new start. The instructions came soft and practical: bring your savings, travel light, don't tell the neighbors. Upstairs, the words were tender; downstairs, the trapdoor waited. When the police finally pried open the cellar, the Appalachian heat did the talking first. In a drainage ditch nearby, they found a mother and her children, Asta Eicher of Illinois, and Greta, Harry, and Annabel, lured here by letters that read like vows and ended like invoices. Another woman lay in the ground as well, Dorothy Pressler Lemke of Massachusetts. 5 victims at minimum, and a paper trail thick with still more women who had answered advertisements with hope. The country was in a depression, faith was a currency, and in Quiet Dell, faith met a ledger. Tonight we unmask the Bluebeard of Quiet Dell, how a drifter with borrowed names learned to turn loneliness into profit, and letters into death warrants. We'll walk the road from the personal ads page to the pit beneath the garage, from a courtroom packed like a tent revival to the gallows at Moundsville, where on March 18, 1932, the promises finally ran out. If stories like this grip you, don't forget to like and subscribe, because this one begins with love letters, and ends in a cellar. The Great Depression taught hard arithmetic in soft places. Across the early 1930s, mills slowed, farms failed, and households learned to measure a week by what could be stretched: coffee grounds, flour, patience. In that economy of scarcity, companionship became both luxury and lifeline. Newspapers printed the usual catastrophes on the front page and the unusual salvations in the classifieds: widower seeks wife, respectable lady desires kind husband. A letter could be a bridge over a winter. A reply could be a promise in an envelope. Into this market of hope stepped a man who treated names like tools. Born Herman Harm Drenth in the Netherlands, he crossed the Atlantic, gathered aliases the way other men gathered jobs, and settled in West Virginia under the working name Harry F. Powers. On the page he was smoother: Cornelius Orvin Pearson, a gentleman with means, ready to provide. He married a local woman, Luella Strother, establishing the picture of respectability: a house in Clarksburg, a routine, a man you could nod to on a weekday without remembering where you'd met him. By day he tended to appearances, by night he tended to correspondence. The letters multiplied. Some went through commercial, Lonely Hearts agencies, some were answered directly from classifieds clipped and saved. The script rarely deviated: attentive questions, swift declarations, a tidy proposal wrapped around prudent instructions about funds. He favored widows and single mothers, women with savings, women tired of shouldering both work and worry, women for whom the word husband still sounded like shade in August. The signatures shifted: Pearson here, Powers there, but the postmarks kept returning to north-central West Virginia. The envelopes promised love. The subtext demanded liquidity. Quiet Dell was a crease in the hills just beyond Clarksburg, the sort of rural pocket where a building could be seen from the road and still remain unseen in its purpose. There, Powers maintained a 2-story garage, ordinary enough from the outside to be ignored, particular enough inside to disclose intention: a hidden cellar under a trapdoor, a place where the upstairs story could end and the downstairs story could begin. In a time when men were pawning tools to buy coal and mothers were stretching soup with prayer, a property like that meant possibility to neighbors. To Powers, it meant privacy. The region's poverty primed the pump. When jobs go scarce, hope does not, it merely gets cheaper to buy. Lonely Hearts ads, already decades old, surged in utility as the world shrank to what a stamp could reach. A widow in Illinois could look east and believe in an address in West Virginia, a divorcee in Massachusetts could fold a letter twice, slip in a photograph, and imagine a train bearing her toward relief. Powers learned their cadences, mirrored their longing, and harvested their trust. Among the many replies, Asta Eicher wrote back, and so did her 3 children, by proxy. So did Dorothy Pressler Lemke. They were not the first to answer. They would be the last to survive the journey only as names. Into these hopes he walked with a ring of keys and a stack of letters, Cornelius on the stationery, Harry at the bank, Drent in the past. The promises would be poured upstairs like coffee. The trapdoor would open downstairs like an invoice coming due. Next, we follow the lures, how affection became a proposal, and how a proposal turned into a route to Quiet Dell. He began with paper, the safest distance there is. On letterhead typed clean and spare, he was Cornelius Orvin Pearson, a civil engineer of means, widowed himself, practical about accounts and tender about companionship. He wrote from Clarksburg, West Virginia, but his return address might change as needed. Aliases were the tools he kept oiled. The Great Depression had made prudence sound like romance. We should be sensible. Bring your savings so we can set up a proper household. We'll keep our plans private until arrangements are secure. For many, the words were the first warmth they'd felt in months. The correspondence did not trickle, it poured. Postal records and contemporary accounts describe replies arriving at a furious clip as Lonely Hearts Clubs and classifieds stitched strangers to strangers. The script rarely varied. First, attentive questions, then, confidence, then, the proposal, offered with efficient haste, finally, specific instructions about money and travel. He crafted a persona at once chivalrous and managerial, the kind of man who could settle a life like a ledger. Behind the paper name Pearson stood a local husband named Harry F. Powers, behind Powers stood a Dutch birth name, Herman, Harm, Drent. The names formed a ladder. At the top of it stood a promise. Among the dozens of women who wrote back, one household in Park Ridge, Illinois would come to anchor the case, Asta Eicher, a widow, and her 3 children, Greta, 14, Harry, 12, and Annabel, 9. The letters from Pearson landed in a kitchen where arithmetic ran tight and hope ran thinner. He presented himself as means and sanctuary, she answered in the grammar of survival. In June 1931, he arrived in Illinois, praised by his own prose, and soon left with Asta for a brief trip that looked, from the curb, like a courtship sealed. The children stayed with a sitter, Elizabeth Abernathy, waiting for instructions. They would come in a letter written to sound like a mother's voice. Mr. Pearson will fetch the children to join us, do not worry about funds. When Pearson returned to collect the children, he pressed the practicalities. Money would be needed for tickets, for trunks, for the new household back east. He sent one child to the bank with a check, the bank refused, the signature was wrong, and a tiny alarm bell rang that no one could yet locate. Still, Mr. Pearson radiated competence. He gathered the children, soothed neighbors with talk of an imminent trip to Europe, and vanished down the line that letters had drawn for him. It would be weeks before anyone could admit the silence had weight. The pattern was already in motion with others. Dorothy Pressler Lemke of Northborough, Massachusetts, a divorced nurse, wrote and received the same bright braid of affection and prudence. She agreed to withdraw her savings, approximately $4,000, and travel to meet her suitor. He handled the luggage with a businessman's efficiency, arranging trunks whose direction said more than their labels, not to the new home he described, but to an address tied to C.O. Pearson in West Virginia. On paper, it looked like logistics. In practice, it was possession, the conversion of a life into freight. In both cases, the choreography was the same. Letters planted an image, a man upright and solvent, a future orderly and near. Travel plans moved victims toward Clarksburg, into the penumbra of a rural pocket called Quiet Dell. There, at the edge of a road most locals ignored by habit, a 2-story garage stood that neighbors could describe but not imagine from the inside. The upstairs was workmanlike, a place where coffee could be poured and papers could be signed. The downstairs was a locked cellar under a trapdoor, a place where the limits of promise were proved by wood and chain. If the letters were honey, the ask was the sting, and he inserted it with surgical steadiness. Before we wed, we must consolidate, best to bring cash, banks fail, as you know. Tell no one, gossip harms good matches. Depression-era prudence became a password to a private road. What sealed the spell was his fluency with female worry. Widows and single mothers read respect in his tone, he answered with attentiveness that felt like rescue. The con worked not because his promises were extravagant but because they were painfully reasonable. Back in Park Ridge, silence lengthened. Mail that should have arrived did not. The sitter's little alarm bells became a clock, then a siren. July turned into August. A local inquiry became a police report became a trail of postmarks that narrowed on Pearson and opened onto Powers, a married man in Clarksburg with a modest shop and an address in Quiet Dell. When officers put hands on him in late August 1931, they found love letters on his person and a tangle of identities under his feet. The house and the garage stood at attention for the search that followed. The garage told the story first. The upstairs held the tools of a meticulous handyman, the basement held the hardware of domination, rope, chain, shackles, stained garments, a trapdoor engineered for convenience. Even in a country used to hard sights, the cellar's logic chilled, a place to promise, and a place to end those promises. Officers fanned out from the building to the yard, following the ground's new geometry, earth turned where no plow should have bitten, a freshly filled ditch along a culvert, the practical camouflage of a man who'd learned that water and time do quick work together. They dug, and the heat answered. In the trench lay Asta Eicher and her 3 children, Greta, Harry, Annabel, a mother and a trio of futures folded and buried. Dorothy Lemke was there as well. The condition of the remains spoke of starvation, beating, and strangulation, one child's small print turned up in blood inside the cellar's rooms. In some accounts a belt still circled a neck, evidence as crude and final as a signature. A garage that had been only a shape from the road had become a map of atrocity. By then the paper record had become a kind of chorus. A trunk of correspondence, letters from women across the country, surfaced among Powers's things, proof that the pipeline of lures ran well beyond the bodies found. Reporters found in the stash a ready-made morality play, a nation of lonely hearts, and a man who had learned to coin loneliness. The Times story that Autumn read with the clinical relish of the era, weighing his face like an exhibit and cataloguing the mail like a harvest. What the crowds learned in the days after the dig was not merely that women and children had died, but that their deaths had been administered, prepared by language, routed by rail, cued by keys. The shock came as much from the bureaucratic neatness as from the brutality. He had scheduled love, and then scheduled murder. In a Depression year when many felt at the mercy of impersonal systems, the Quiet Dell cellar looked like an office where human feeling was processed into profit. For investigators reconstructing the lure, the beats were painfully clear. Affection quickened into proposal, proposal yoked to money. Secrecy framed as prudence, distance framed as romance's necessary bridge. A meeting arranged in West Virginia, with luggage and cash in hand. A pause upstairs, papers, tea, the illusion of safety. Downstairs, a trapdoor, restraints, and a man who had rehearsed the choreography until it fit inside an afternoon. When Asta and the children failed to reappear, the web of letters that had lured them became the rope that pulled their killer to daylight. Alias collapsed into identity, Pearson collapsed into Powers, husband collapsed into predator. The garage in Quiet Dell had been engineered to divide the 2 stories of a lie. The police knit them back together with spades and warrants. Other correspondents, women who had answered the same ads, surfaced in the paperwork and in the testimonies that would follow. Some had sent photographs, some small sums, some everything. The scale of his outreach ensured that even the known dead felt like a fraction of an intent that stretched beyond state lines. In Quiet Dell, the fraction was enough to name, prosecute, and hang. Elsewhere, it would live on in cautionary columns and whispered advice: do not send money, do not travel alone, do not believe a stranger's paper name. If Section 1 belonged to the market that made such letters plausible, Section 2 belongs to the mechanism that made them fatal. Asta's careful mothering, Dorothy's administrative steadiness, qualities that might have steadied a life in ordinary times, were precisely the qualities he exploited. He sold certainty to women who needed it, then dissolved them into evidence: letters, trunks, receipts, a burned bankbook, a ditch. The men who lifted those things from the property lifted, with them, the last protections of euphemism. With the ditch uncovered and the cellar laid bare, the Khan's romance turned literal crime scene. The next question rose like heat from the trench: who was this man, really? The letters had worn one mask, the garage another. To understand how a husband in Clarksburg became a Bluebeard by correspondence, the story had to leave the pit and follow the man, back through Holland, through aliases, through a marriage that gave him cover, and into a mind where greed and emptiness learned to write the same hand. By late August 1931, the paper trail had tightened into a map. Letters in Cornelius O. Pearson's hand led detectives from Park Ridge, Illinois to a lane south of Clarksburg, West Virginia, to a two-story garage in a fold of hills locals called Quiet Dell. From the road it was ordinary: wood siding, upstairs windows, double doors yawning wide enough for a sedan. The ordinary ended under the floor. A trapdoor opened onto a cellar carved for privacy, not storage, for small rooms, each with a purpose the hardware made plain. Ropes hung like questions. Chains waited with their answers. On pegs and in corners, shackles, bloody clothing, a burned bankbook, and the small, obscene print of a child's foot left in blood. The smell turned officers into archivists of air before they became excavators of earth. They searched the building first, the upstairs neat, workable, the downstairs engineered for control. If the letters were bait, this was the hook, a space designed to separate promise from conclusion, upstairs from below. Beyond the walls the ground itself looked edited: fresh fill, a ditch that ran along a drainage swale as if it had been reshaped to cooperate with water. A boy from the neighborhood told the sheriff he'd been paid to dig a trench there days earlier. Shovels followed the line he pointed out. The hillside gave up its names. They found 5. Asta Eicher and her 3 children, Greta, Harry, Annabel, buried together, and Dorothy Pressler Lemke nearby. The bodies confirmed what the cellar had suggested: this was not rage in motion but murder administered. Later accounts fixed the methods: Asta and her daughters strangled, young Harry killed by blunt force, Lemke strangled, a belt still around her neck when she was lifted from the ground. Details like these do not just satisfy curiosity, they describe a process. Upstairs, paper and persuasion; downstairs, restraints; outside, earth and ditches disposal. The cellar read like a manual without verbs. In one room, lengths of rope cut to human measures, ends hardened by flame. In another, chains bolted where a wall stud would hold, shackles whose dimensions remembered wrists and ankles. A third space, bare, seemed designed for waiting, a pause between upstairs coffee and downstairs sentence. On a table, garments stained past guesswork. In a tin, the charred remains of a bankbook, pages made unreadable on purpose. The child's footprint was not metaphor. It was the print of a life at the smallest scale the law can still name. Outside, the site became a living diagram. Citizens gathered at a distance first, then nearer, then inside, until the garage had more witnesses in a week than customers in a year. Photographers framed the ditch like a stage. A woman in one image leans over the cut earth as if listening for confession. Another photograph shows a crowd posing in front of the building where 2 women and 3 children had died, proof that even in 1931, atrocity could turn public faster than decency could find its shoes. Back in Park Ridge, the timeline hardened. June 28, 1931, Asta left with Mr. Pearson, promising the children would join once arrangements were set. July, the children were fetched, a forged signature tried and failed at a bank, a neighbor comforted by talk of a European trip. August, no letters, no return. Then, Clarksburg police tracing Pearson to Harry F. Powers and his wife in town, and his garage in Quiet Dell. In the cellar, the bloody footprint made the transition from suspicion to certainty with a single step. In the ditch, certainty multiplied. For investigators, the narrative of the building assembled itself. Architecture as alibi, a respectable workshop above, a designed prison below. Hardware as intention, rope cut and kept, chains anchored, shackles sized. Paper as solvent, the burned bankbook and destroyed records to break the trial's arithmetic. Ground as ledger, the ditch that carried water and hid evidence until spades wrote it open. The autopsy rooms confirmed what the cellar implied, the deaths were controlled, close, and quick. Strangulation leaves consistent signatures on soft tissue and hyoid bone, blunt force trauma shouts its own language on skull and scalp. Nothing in the evidence suggested panic, everything suggested repetition. The basement was not a scene of accident or escalation, it was a stage set for a scene the killer had rehearsed on paper and then performed in wood and chain. Pieces of life turned up wherever a drawer opened, letters bundled with rubber bands, photographs of women who had written in hope, trunks redirected to Pearson's addresses, a stack of correspondence that widened the radius of the harm beyond the 5 buried at the property. Reporters would later make hay of the volume, 10 to 20 letters a day, as one often quoted line put it, but for police the meaning was simpler, the lure pipeline was national even if the killing floor was local. Neighbors furnished the practical footnotes investigators always need. The teen laborer who had been hired to dig. The passerby who remembered odd hours at the garage. The grocer who sold staples to a man who did not eat more. The wife in town, Luella Struther, who could vouch for a husband's daily regularities and for how little those regularities revealed. The elegant cruelty of the place was its compartmentalization, virtue and violence stacked one floor apart. By the second day, the garage's upstairs-downstairs logic had become the shorthand the press needed. Reporters described the trapdoor with the same relish they brought to opera house courtrooms and angry crowds. The narrative sold itself because it fit a fairy tale shape inverted, a Bluebeard who did not need a castle, only a workman's shed and a draft of letters. The cellar was a folklore engine, turning loneliness into loot and bodies into myth. Forensic neatness did not blunt grief's edge. Officers wrapped small forms the way they would their own, because lawmen in rural counties are also fathers and uncles and neighbors. Asta's body was lifted with professional silence that could not quiet the noise in the men's heads. Dorothy Lemke, who had trusted a postmarked promise, emerged last, a belt still cinched where a husband's hands should have been. The recovery ended with 5 names returned to daylight and a building whose every nail now seemed to point. What the Quiet Dell garage proved, beyond the particular murders, was a method, marriage as pretext, paper as passage, architecture as weapon. It is one thing to imagine a killer carried by impulse, it is another to stand above a designed space and recognize that a man measured rope and placed bolts and cut wood until a cellar could do what a letter had promised, change lives, only not in the way the recipients had read. When the digging stopped and the crowds thinned, the garage remained, a residue of intention. Boards were pried up for evidence, soil was sifted, the ditch was filled and marked. But places like this don't return to neutral. The upstairs smelled forever of downstairs. The trapdoor turned any floor into a warning. Drivers who had never before slowed on that road slowed now, rubbernecking the way a nation would soon rubberneck the trial. The cellar had told its part, the man would have to answer for it. The excavation unearthed bodies, it also unearthed identity. Pearson collapsed into Powers, Harry into Herman Drenth, a Dutch immigrant with a local wife, a tidy house, and a basement philosophy of profit. To understand how the letterwriter became the Bluebeard of Quiet Dell, the story has to leave the garage and trail the man behind the names, through immigration cards and marriage records, old arrests and new lies, into the psychology that could build a trapdoor and call it a plan. He treated names the way other men treat tools, kept them sharpened, swapped them mid-job, left them where fingerprints were hard to find. On immigration papers he was Herman Drenth, born in Berda, Groningen, Netherlands, who came to America in 1910. In West Virginia he became Harry F. Powers. In the classifieds and letters that caught lonely eyes, he signed himself Cornelius Orvin Pearson. A few older rap sheets added still more handles, John Schroeder, R. Weaver, Joseph Gildow, as if identity for him were a coat rack, not a spine. The path from immigrant to gentleman suitor ran through ordinary respectability. After drifting through the Midwest, a short stay in Cedar Rapids, Iowa appears on the paper trail, he settled in Clarksburg, West Virginia by the mid-1920s and in 1927 married Luella Strother, a local woman who owned a small farm and grocery. The pairing gave him a house, a wife who could vouch for his routines, and a foothold in a community that valued work and quiet. By EWV's account, neighbors knew him as the bespectacled proprietor of a Broad Oaks grocery, 5'4", stocky, unremarkable. Respectability was the mask that didn't slip. But the paper underneath the mask told a rougher story. When police compared fingerprints after his August 1931 arrest, they tied Powers back to Herman Drenth, a man incarcerated for burglary in Wisconsin a decade earlier. Other suspicions, an unsolved disappearance of a carpet sweeper salesman he once worked with, a Jane Doe far from West Virginia, trailed him in newsprint, unproven but sticky. What is certain is this: by the time he was writing as Pearson, he already understood how records could be bent and how aliases could ferry him across county lines without changing shoes. His method as a correspondent hardly varied. He culled addresses from Lonely Hearts agencies, including the American Friendship Society of Detroit, and wrote in a tone that braided prudence and tenderness, a widower of means, eager for marriage, careful about money, weary of gossip. The Depression made that voice persuasive. In a country of failing banks, the sentence, "Bring cash so we can set up properly," sounded like competence. "Keep our plans private," sounded like romance protecting itself. Postal clerks later told reporters the replies poured in at 10 to 20 letters a day, a volume that turned loneliness into a ledger. The garage at Quiet Dell completed the persona. To the road it looked like a tradesman's shed, to detectives it read like a diagram of what his letters promised and what his hands performed. Upstairs was coffee, talk, an air of businesslike order. Downstairs, through a trapdoor, were ropes, chains, shackles, a burned bankbook, and a child's bloody footprint. Architecture made his ethic legible. He believed in compartments. One floor kept marriage talk clean, the other made money of the talk. He had built the cellar, he had stocked it, he had measured rope the way he measured words. Psychology hangs loosely on such men in the record of the 1930s. There were no diagnostic reports, no interviews conducted by trained clinicians, only observations of effect. Still, patterns speak. Witnesses and journalists described a flatness, a man, cold and unemotional, even when confronted with letters and bodies. Greed seems the simplest through line, not the gambler's risk joy but a bureaucrat's appetite, tidy and unshakable. Marriage, for him, was an instrument, love letters, a supply chain, women and children, assets to be converted. The language of the era's coverage, Bluebeard, fairy tale villainy, was a cultural reach for a figure whose motive felt more ledger than legend. Even his marriage to Luella looks, in hindsight, like a hinge in the con. According to the West Virginia Encyclopedia, he met her through a Lonely Hearts ad as well. That origin story granted him fluency. He knew the grammar of the promises because he had already rehearsed it at home. Domestic normalcy by day, a wife, a shop, neighbors who waved, gave him cover for night work at the typewriter. The upstairs/downstairs logic of his garage echoed in his life: husband above, predator below, one floor apart. If there was ritual in his crimes, it lived in sequence, not symbol. The letters did the sorting, the alias did the approach, the proposal set the terms, the cash and trunks made the transfer, the trapdoor closed the account. The most chilling detail in the official narrative is not the specific hardware recovered but the consistency of the choreography. Asta Eicher and her children, Dorothy Pressler Lemke, different origins, same route, different lives, same cellar. Repetition is the closest thing to confession he left. For all the talk of fairy tales, the Bluebeard nickname stuck because it fit a public need more than it fit the man. Reporters and later novelists reached for story shapes that could contain the scandal. Davis Grubbs' The Night of the Hunter transmuted it into a preacher wolf fable. Jane and Phillips's Quiet Dell returned to the property to stage grief and aftermath as Gothic tragedy. The real Powers remained smaller and meaner: no castle, no secret room key, only a mailbox, a trapdoor, and a belief that human trust could be monetized like scrap. When investigators finally pressed through his aliases, they found that the paper man and the cellar man aligned with a ghastly neatness. The fingerprints said Drenth. The neighbors said Powers. The envelopes said Pearson. Only the evidence said murderer, and it said it in plural, in the voice of a mother and 3 children and a woman who had withdrawn $4,000 because a suitor told her it was sensible. That is the truest profile available, a man who could make sensibility itself into a weapon. With the mask lifted and the cellar mapped, the stage shifted from the garage to the opera house in Clarksburg. Reporters packed the aisles, the public surged the streets, the evidence, letters, trunks, ropes, the ditch, took the witness stand in other people's mouths. Next comes the trial, a 5-day spectacle that ended on December 12, 1931, in a death sentence, and after that, the march to Moundsville, where, on March 18, 1932, the promises stopped. Clarksburg had no courtroom large enough for what the public demanded to see. So in December 1931, the county moved justice onto a stage. Moore's Opera House was refitted as a courtroom, the footlights traded for evidence tables, the balcony for a gallery of gawkers and reporters. Part practical necessity, Harrison County's new courthouse was still under construction, part theater, the choice fixed the tone before the first witness swore an oath. The city had already rehearsed a darker script in September. When word spread that Harry F. Powers, the husband from Broad Oaks, the letter writer from Clarksburg, the man now nicknamed the Bluebeard of Quiet Dell, had confessed, a lynch mob formed at the county jail. Police spirited him to Moundsville for safekeeping, a fact that would keep the courtroom later from being a morgue. The appetite for punishment preceded the trial, the Opera House merely gave its seats. Proceedings opened the week of December 7, 1931. The charge selected for trial was the murder of Dorothy Pressler Lemke. One victim was enough in law to hang a man, and her case presented the cleanest line of proof. The prosecution wheeled its exhibit of the ordinary made obscene, letters in a gentleman's hand promising marriage and prudence, trunks and shipping stubs, the Quiet Dell trapdoor, the chains, rope, and stained garments from the cellar, and, finally, the recovery of 5 bodies in the ditch outside. Witnesses stitched each item to a timeline the jury could carry back to its room without getting lost. The love letters read from the stand had the unnerving quality of instruments displayed after an amputation, clean lines, steady tone, meant for care, used for harm. Jurors heard how Cornelius Orvin Pearson pressed for secrecy, cash, and speed, how Dorothy drew down her savings and followed his instructions, how the trunks she thought were bound for a new home instead found their way to Pearson/Powers. Reporters noted the trunkful of correspondence seized from his house, a paper chorus of women who had written in good faith. Detectives carried the opera house downstairs without moving an inch. They described the basement, its shackles, measured ropes, the burned bankbook, even the child's bloody footprint, and then walked the jury out into the open air, to the sewage trench where the digging stopped pretense. The state did not need rhetoric, it had architecture and earth. The effect on the room was the hush people mistake for reverence. In truth it is the quiet of an audience seeing that the story requires no embellishment. The man at the center did not help himself. Observers recorded little remorse, a flat effect that felt to many like contempt. When he spoke, he was careful and tidy, as if moving figures from one column to another. The nickname Bluebeard followed him into the box not because he resembled a fairy tale lord but because the city needed a name big enough to carry what it felt. The prosecution did not need a monster, it needed a method, and it had one. Outside, Clarksburg wore the case like a fair. The opera house steps filled each morning before the doors opened, the gallery overflowed with locals and travelers, wire service men filed copy that moved as fast as telegraph keys could be struck. A news photo from the week shows a crowd straining at the entrance, the caption dry as docket ink, Moore Opera House, December 8, 1931, trial of Harry F. Powers. Inside, the judge kept the staging plain, evidence in, rumor out, pace brisk. 5 days would suffice. The defense had few places to stand. It could suggest that the letters proved only romance, not murder, that the cellar's hardware could be read as handyman's odds and ends, that confessions once made under pressure were not to be trusted. But the sequence, letters, travel, upstairs pause, trapdoor, downstairs restraints, ditch, refused to unbraid. When the state rested, it had handed the jury not a theory but a map. On December 12, 1931, after about 2 hours of deliberation by some contemporary accounts, the jury returned guilty. The sentence followed the verdict the way a shadow follows a man at noon, death by hanging. The opera house had played courtroom convincingly enough, the state would play scaffold next. Clarksburg spilled back into the streets, telephones trilled up and down the East Coast, editors slotted the story high. For many readers, the trial as theater completed what the cellar had begun. It fixed the narrative in images anyone could carry, love letters on the witness stand, a trapdoor described in public voice, an unemotional man sentenced beneath the painted ceiling of a theater. That odd marriage of spectacle and procedure would follow the case into its afterlife, in headlines and, later, in novels that reimagined Quiet Dell as American Gothic. With the verdict certain, only the date remained. The state would bring him back to Moundsville, where on March 18, 1932, the trapdoor would open in another building, this one designed for the purpose. Crowds would gather again, beyond the walls, to witness what they could not see, a ledger balanced, a sentence carried out, an end that looked like justice to many and like silence to the rest. Dawn never quite warms the stone at Moundsville. On Friday, March 18, 1932, the penitentiary woke to the choreography it knew too well, a scaffold checked, a rope measured, witnesses counted, a chaplain on call. Outside the walls, people lined the curbs and idled cars for blocks, the way they had lined streets for parades in easier years. Inside, the state laid out its instruments, plain as farm tools, and waited for the man the papers had named the Bluebeard of Quiet Dell. He had been sentenced 3 months earlier, after the 5-day Opera House trial in Clarksburg. Now the venue changed from stage to gallows. The warden read the warrant aloud, a bureaucratic voice over a moral cliff. Powers's answers were sparse. Reporters and later chroniclers agreed on the manner if not the poetry, a small, bespectacled man, cold, unemotional, silent to the end. When the trap released, his body dropped, physicians would not pronounce him dead until several minutes had passed. The official ritual converted a headline into a line on a prison register. Crowds remained beyond the stone, as if sound could leak back through it and confirm that justice had a voice. Their presence felt less like celebration than like insurance, the community's insistence that the story reach a period rather than an ellipsis. The penitentiary had handled scores of executions over 6 decades, this one drew the widest circle of onlookers since the prison first raised a scaffold. What the public could not see, they enacted with posture, stillness, hats held, a glance toward the yard whenever a door clanged. Inside the witness room, the case's paperwork reassembled itself in people, a few officials who had carried letters into evidence, officers who had lifted bodies from a ditch, clerks who had boxed exhibits and catalogued them the way one catalogues seasons. To them, the mechanics were familiar. What was not familiar was the shape of the damage, a mother and 3 children from Illinois, and a woman from Massachusetts, all drawn into a cellar by stationery and a soft hand with instructions. A gallows can balance a verdict, it cannot balance arithmetic like that. News bulletins traveled faster than trains. By evening, papers as far as Camden and Cleveland had set type, Bluebeard dies on scaffold, pledged to the sentence that Moundsville had carried out that morning. The copy summed a year of public appetite in a few inches, Lonely Hearts letters, a trapdoor in a garage, a trapdoor in a prison, and left the rest to readers who had stood at fences in Quiet Dell or on sidewalks in Clarksburg and now pictured a rope they would never touch. If Powers refused confession, the apparatus around him confessed in his place. The state admitted, by its care with hardware and witnesses, that there are acts a community cannot fold back into daily life without ceremony. The crowd admitted that stories do not end on paper, they end where people agree they end. And the prison admitted what the garage had already announced, some buildings are made to divide stories into upstairs and below, before and after, promise and consequence. The rope answered the law's question, what shall be done with the guilty, but not the county's larger one, what shall we do with what he left behind? In the years that followed, Quiet Dell became a synonym, the case seeded novels and footnotes, tourist whispers and cautionary lectures about ads and aliases. The cellar closed, the legend opened. Next, we follow that afterlife, how a hollow in West Virginia became part of America's Gothic memory, and how the phrase, lonely hearts, changed for good. Quiet Dell did not return to silence, it became a synonym. Newspapers fixed the nickname, Bluebeard of Quiet Dell, in the American lexicon, and West Virginians learned to hear the place name as a warning about aliases, promises, and trapdoors, both the literal kind and the ones that open in letters. The state's own histories still tally the victims, Asta Eicher, her 3 children, and Dorothy Pressler Lemke, and mark the crime's geography, a hollow outside Clarksburg where a garage turned loneliness into loot. Popular culture carried the case farther than any headline could. Davis Grubb's 1953 novel The Night of the Hunter, and the 1955 film, transmuted Powers into a fable of predatory charm in small-town America. The story is explicitly tied to the Quiet Dell murders in standard references. Decades later, Jane and Phillips's novel Quiet Dell returned to the scene in a blend of archive and imagination, ensuring that the cellar under the garage remained part of the nation's Gothic memory rather than a footnote in a county file. Law and media drew lessons in different keys. The execution at Moundsville on March 18, 1932 closed the state's ledger, but the case lived on in coverage that made Lonely Hearts a byword for risk. Period accounts lingered on the trunk of correspondence and the Opera House trial, turning paperwork into spectacle and cautionary tale. The result was a template American readers would recognize for generations: the suitor with borrowed names, the respectable front, the cellar that reveals the cost of credulity. What endures beyond titles and type is the small arithmetic of the victims' lives. A mother who answered a letter because it sounded sensible, 3 children who traveled because a grown-up said to, a woman who withdrew savings because a future needed funding. Those facts remain steady in the state's reference works and in local memory. They are the ballast against the myth's drift. A low West Virginia hillside, summer gone to seed, and beneath it an empty cellar, no ropes now, no chains, only the shape of a room that once divided upstairs promise from downstairs truth. The letters have yellowed, the gallows is quiet, but the warning still speaks plainly: beware the paper name, the private plan, the door that opens the wrong way. Quiet Dell's story ends, and continues, there.